Public comment. The Pennridge School Board welcomes public comment according to policy 903. We remind everyone of the following. Public comment shall be limited to 3 minutes unless otherwise specified by the board. Participants must be recognized by the presiding officer and note their name and municipality. All statements shall be directed to the presiding officer rather than to individual board members, district employees, or members of the public. Thanks. A member may speak once during each comment period. Please note, these sessions are designated for comments to protect the confidentiality, privacy rights of all members and of our community. The board encourages members of the public to direct any comments regarding particular individuals, such as students, district employees, privately to the superintendent, or other appropriate administrators or board members, or to communicate with the board and superintendent privately by sending an email to the psdschoolboard@pennridge.org. Questions raised and not addressed may be followed up at a later time. All right, the first on our agenda, excuse me, is the review of the policy for, it's a second reading and final approval for policy number 808 for food service.
So we presented policy 808 food services and the changes that are recommended at the last policy committee meeting. So unless there are any questions, this policy would then be moved for final approval at the January 22nd meeting. Anybody have any questions or comments about that policy?
Yeah, there was one. Oh, is there? I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay, hearing none.
Okay. The next one is policy number 916, which is background check for school volunteers.
Okay, so this is our first reading of policy 916. There was discussion at the last policy committee meeting about the changes that we would be made, so those changes have been incorporated in the draft that's provided. If there are any questions or comments, I can take those. Also, I was reviewing this just prior to our meeting, and I did find on page 4 of 4, under clearances, it still states all new volunteers, whether categorized as classroom volunteers, athletic volunteers, or otherwise, must submit their clearances. So that was just missed, those should be deleted. So it should say all volunteers must submit, and then the listed clearances there. So that's a correction that we'll make for the first reading at the board meeting on the 22nd. Okay? So any other questions or comments?
I do.
Okay.
I do. Okay. This policy addresses volunteers and says very little about background checks. So in looking through our policy manual, I don't see a specific policy on volunteers. So I would propose that we rename this volunteers and have a section, as we do now, that addresses the clearances. Okay. So it's just when the policy is called background checks for volunteers, there's very little about background checks in here. We spend a lot of time talking about, definitions of who's who and what they can and can't do. So I just think that first I'd like to start with renaming it, if that's feasible. Okay. And the other questions I have revolve around, as it applies to our volunteers, nowhere in here does it indicate who's responsible for maintaining the list of authorized volunteers, or volunteers that are cleared to work within certain buildings or all buildings or whatnot. So I don't see, any responsibility there for somebody to maintain a list of volunteers and their status. When are their clearances due? So that we can monitor this as well. And the last thing I had on that, and there's a little ambiguity here. At one point it says, let me get through it.
Bill, while you're doing that, can I respond to what you just said?
Absolutely.
Just thinking, that the policy is a little broader than, than the more specific guidelines to implement the policy. So what you're suggesting, I think, makes some sense, but maybe not necessarily incorporated into the policy, because every time you change who's monitoring these things, then you'd be changing the policy. So probably guidelines to support this would make sense.
And that's okay. I think if we wanted to do it at a higher level, you could indicate that, you know, administration shall maintain a list of
Right.
volunteers
Right.
at this level. I'm not trying to be prescriptive here. I think, you know,
That part makes
I want to give you as much flexibility as we can, so that you can do your job, but I want to be able to monitor the volunteers as well.
We just want to keep bringing the policy back.
No, agreed.
Yeah.
And I guess the last, here it says, under procedure, it says the superintendent and/or his designee shall maintain supervisory control over the use of volunteers and shall provide administrative guidelines, and that's fine. But then as we get into the specific volunteers, everything defers to the superintendent or the principal, or the building principal. So we're at one point we say that the superintendent is responsible, and then at a later point, we say the superintendent or the building principals. And I'm okay either way. I just want to be consistent. So that, where I'm looking specifically is right at the start of procedures.
And they're the ones that you're saying that they maintain a list of.
Well, I don't care who maintains, the building principals can maintain the list of, you know.
If I can answer that, that is maintained in human resources. So I think we could add in that section there, right under procedures, superintendent or his or her designee shall maintain supervisory control. And we can also list that they would maintain the list of volunteers.
And that's fine, wherever we do it,
Yep.
I'd like to maintain a list so that we can monitor, you know, who it is, what clearances they have, and when they expire, if
Right.
that's feasible.
But are you saying that in the beginning it says superintendent
Right, the
and or its designee, or his designee, and then later on it says
Right.
superintendent and principal, it's specific.
Right,
So you would have to change the language to say designee throughout instead of identifying a specific person.
Right, the only one of the examples though, on page 3 of 4, if you look at number 4, under that section, that has to do with when the volunteer is actually in the building. That's when we have to bring the principal into that, because the principal, it says, shall participate in a classroom, co-curricular or extracurricular activity without prior knowledge of the building principal. So the principal has to know who's coming into their building. That's why that's included there.
so if the superintendent has supervisory control, again, in number 4 there on page 3 of 4, the last
Right,
the last section says the building principal, superintendent, and/or his designee and/or board retains the right to withdraw approval of any classroom volunteer with or without cause. The approval of, I'm just saying, I just want to be consistent.
right. So in that instance, there could be an example of something that, a volunteer was in a building and something happened that maybe the principal is not comfortable having that volunteer back in the building. So that's why, again, we include principal there, but they would be making a recommendation to the superintendent or the board.
And the last thing I'd bring up, and we've brought it up for years, is credentialing of volunteers. That the volunteers are identified with badging.
Yes.
And we've asked, and I don't mean the Raptor system. I mean a legitimate badge, kind of like the board members have, that identifies them as a bona fide volunteer.
So aside from this policy, that's something that you would like to see.
And that can be part of this with credentialing of volunteers, or however
Okay.
you want to address that. But I think it's something, because when we come in here, somebody comes in on a Saturday, we don't know which volunteer is authorized to be in here or not. Raptor's not up and running.
You're talking about like maybe the moms that are running the PTOs, the heavy.
Well, any of the volunteers.
Well, because some people that volunteer are just going in to read.
Or like a.
We were talking about different levels of volunteers too, like having classroom visitors and whether or not they
And that's
need to
addressed
be-
in there.
You
Yeah.
know, so,
That's
I know,
addressed.
so I'm saying like, we would need to make clear lines of who would get a badge and who.
Like
So-
tiering it.
Right, so visitors
tier it.
aren't required to
Right.
obtain clearances, they
They're
wouldn't
gonna
need
get
a
elected
badge. But
right.
if it's somebody on our approved volunteer list, that's what you're requesting?
That's what I'm,
Is that they-
that's what I'm referring to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Cross, you're, in the beginning, you had said that you wanted to propose that we consider a different name for policy 916, and I understand what you were trying to say. But it does say background checks for school volunteers, where what it's really is a clearance for volunteers. So perhaps if we were going to consider changing the name of policy 916, I would make the suggestion that it should be clearances.
But there's so little in here about the
Right,
clearances.
agreed.
Requirements.
However, and if you look at page 4 of 4, okay?
That's all
The
that's
very last
required.
section, that
Yeah.
clearly defines what your clearances are. However, Dr. Wyoke just said that we were gonna be taking out that one paragraph, which stipulates those three.
No, it's
No.
only, it's only gonna
Clearances.
say, it's
The
it's only one
clearances,
word.
right, the clearances would still be there. So
Okay,
how
good.
that would read would say, all volunteers
Okay.
must submit Act 34, Act 151, and
Yeah.
FBI
And
clearances.
those are your big three. That's the clearances required. So I think it is defined in there. I just feel like I see the disconnect between the name of the policy and what it's really doing. So, maybe tighten that gap by just changing. Can we do that? Can we change
We
it
can change the name
from
of the
background checks to clearances?
We can change it to
Something-
anything we want, as far as I know.
Something a little,
I'll double check, I don't.
There's nothing.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Prohibiting
Would that,
us from
would that
changing.
address the issue then, you think? I don't wanna change something that doesn't make sense.
I'm
You
more
see what I'm saying?
comfortable with volunteers, but okay.
So you just want 916 to be volunteers?
This is how, this
Yeah,
is,
and because it is pretty broad, it does more than talk about clearances.
True.
It talks about what they, their activity, their
what they can and can't do,
procedures.
what, specific volunteers.
Okay,
are-
I see what
are
you're saying now.
responsible for.
Okay.
so is the recommendation for the top title to say 916 volunteers?
That's my,
Okay.
Yeah, so get rid of that
Request.
background checks for school. And just leave volunteers. Is that what you want it to say?
that would.
I
that
think
would
that
make
makes
me happy,
sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
So does that mean everything else that's volunteer related is going to be put under here? Is there any
Well,
other,
Are there
There's no other
other-
policy that addresses volunteers.
so this is just
I know,
every,
but what you gotta think
Perfect.
about, what about,
Yeah.
do you need your background checks to work in the concession stand at the football games? Aren't you volunteering then?
I think
No,
they're
they're
supposed to.
employees.
There's a definition. So volunteer shall mean an adult serving in an unpaid position who's responsible for the welfare of a child or having direct contact with children.
They don't already have it, I guess we didn't. The last time I did a concession stand, it was before, I think we changed, but
And we're
Right,
talking
yeah.
about the
In that
tiers.
definition.
When there's
would-
an
would to
athletic
me
volunteer, a
say
direct
concessions,
contact
right?
volunteer.
So
Shouldn't
I
this
guess if you
say,
have the
Or
different
is the concession
tiers
stand
listed in here,
volunteer?
then it doesn't matter, because
Right.
it is all under volunteers, and specific volunteers don't need.
so should page 1 of 4, under definitions, we see athletic volunteer is a type of volunteer, correct?
Mhm.
Yes.
And then if we skip to the next page, it says volunteer.
Correct.
And then you have direct contact in between. So,
Adults be
And
fine,
visitor.
and I didn't see visitor.
That's underneath
written-
volunteer.
that's written
Oh,
on
under there,
down.
okay. So these are just listed alphabetically then, right?
Direct contact's not redlined out.
No.
I was
Direct
gonna say,
contact
direct
isn't.
contact
Yeah.
is not redlined, I'm
So care, supervision, guidance, and control of children, and routine interaction with children.
I don't know, I think if you just change it to volunteers, I think it's too broad of a topic. I think you need to have a couple words around it.
Volunteer requirements,
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
volunteer roles and responsibilities.
Volunteer policy.
It's a policy, so let's,
Yeah.
we can't get too prescriptive. It's a top
Dr.
level
Ware, this wasn't
policy.
changed yet, correct? This is the PSBA title?
Yes, the
So
PSBA
what do you
title.
think?
Do we have to keep with the PSB titles or no? Can we critique it and actually change it?
I don't think we ever had that question.
I don't think so. I mean, I'd have to check. I don't see why you couldn't, as long as the number stays the same, we try not to get too different, because then when changes come, you've got to
Yeah,
find your
that's what I'm
existing
thinking,
policy that
long
matches
term.
the PSBA policy.
But I look at PSBA as a global guidance, and we need to do what's right for Pennridge.
Right, right.
What about volunteer clearances and procedures?
Mhm.
Which
Because
one?
then you'll still have the word in there, although if you're changing it from background checks, you'll still have the problem if you're trying to find it when it's consensus. It is odd that they call it background checks.
Well,
Yeah.
and this is first reading, so I can take all the
Let's
notes,
just see what, yeah.
and make some of the recommended changes, check into the
Yeah.
title requirement,
That's a good idea.
and then we have a second reading and final approval, so.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. I do think that's a good idea about having a tiered system of volunteers, and then you can equate that to a badge. I do think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
Hmm?
Anything else?
Well,
Any
it's not
other?
realistic to have badges for somebody who,
What's that?
that makes sense. But you're not asking for badges for visitors.
No,
You're
'cause they'll
asking
get a-
for-
They'll get a Raptor badge.
Well, you get a visitor badge.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, yeah, I get what you're saying.
Mhm.
I agree.
Any more questions from anybody or comments? Okay.
Okay.
You have all your notes, right?
I have all my notes.
Okay. All right, back to public comment. Any public comment? Nobody?
I just say y'all need to break that into about 4 parts. I would say volunteers, definition, volunteers, background check needed, volunteers who maintains the records at the school, and volunteers, what to do if somebody, you need some kind of policy, what to do if they, you know, do something that they shouldn't do. That it sounds like you got 4 or 5 A, B, C, D, and E that need to be defined and broken out. That would be my advice.
Aren't those, can I ask a question related to, aren't those issues addressed in other policies?
Well, we tried in this policy, because it was confusing before, to have classroom volunteers, existing volunteers, new volunteers.
Mhm.
So we tried to clean that up to
Right.
make it much more concise
Mhm.
and specific to athletic volunteer,
Right.
volunteer,
But related
and
to
visitor.
Mrs. Furlong's concern on what if the volunteer breaks a rule or does something, but does other policies exist that address those issues? Do you know what I'm?
Specific to volunteers.
So if a volunteer did something that
Stayed after hours,
stayed after hours,
showed up without a badge,
showed up without a badge.
where the school bus without permission. I mean, I
I'm
can
super
think of all kinds
creative
of
all of a
things.
sudden.
No.
But that's-
So, are there policies elsewhere
I
that
see that
would show
within
how
this,
we would
though.
handle?
Yeah, that's what,
It's within
this
this.
provides for whoever's in charge of that volunteer to make decisions about, you know, whether that volunteer should be allowed to remain as a volunteer.
So then it's
So-
in the policy.
So it's left with the building principal, the superintendent, or the board.
Mhm.
Okay,
And
so-
that's why we need to rename it.
Yeah.
Just going back to what you're saying, it makes sense.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other public comments? Okay, this meeting adjourned.
Okay.